All families in the UK are set to be worse off by 2030. That's right, every single family, from the wealthiest to the poorest, is heading into a financial storm that no amount of political promises seems to be able to halt. But, and here's the kicker, it is the most vulnerable who will feel the brunt of this crisis. Hello, I'm Adam Cherry, and this is GBN Originals. So recent data from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation paints an absolutely dire picture. By 2030, the average British family will be £1,400 worse off annually. And for those on the lowest incomes, I'm afraid it's even worse. They're set to lose £900 of disposable income by 2030, which is a 6% drop. What is the reason for that? The cost of living isn't just rising, it's absolutely soaring. Housing costs, energy prices, the cost of food, the spiralling cost of rent, mortgage, it's all contributing to this massive squeeze. Now, this data, which is based on forecasts from the Office for Budget Responsibility, which admittedly does get some things wrong, and you're hoping they've had an absolute corker here. Nonetheless, it paints a picture that will be pretty hard to stomach. But it's one that politicians are going to need to confront head on, particularly because this will be happening around the election time in 2029, 2030. We're looking at a situation where those in the poorest third of the population will be disproportionately affected. It's not just a few extra quid at the end of the month. It is a serious erosion of financial security. So for those paying a mortgage, you can expect to pay around £1,400 more a year in interest. And for renters, that number's around £300 extra. Meanwhile, average earnings are projected to fall by £700. So just to be clear, your housing costs are going up and your wages are going down. Your disposable income is basically evaporating. So these facts are absolutely damning. If we don't get a handle on this by 2030, we'll become the first, or we'll see the first government since 1955 to preside over a full term where living standards have actually fallen. That's the reality we're facing at the moment. Regardless of who's in charge or whatever, forget your political allegiances, just look at this data. It is pretty scary. Now, it's worth considering the political backdrop here. Labour, under Prime Minister Keir Starmer, came into power with a promise to make working people better off. Change. You remember the manifesto, Keir Starmer, solemn looking directly down the camera. Change, a new dawn is breaking, is it not? That kind of thing. Well, unfortunately, as these latest figures show, the pledge is already looking pretty hollow, actually. In fact, it looks like Keir Starmer is heading for a major fail on his first big economic milestone. Now, the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, is preparing to make her spring statement this week. That's on Wednesday. And she'll be looking to trim public spending even more to meet the government's so-called ironclad fiscal rules. So rather than increasing borrowing or raising taxes, I'm sure you'll agree we've had plenty of that already, the current strategy is to make cuts. And if you're thinking that's going to be a tough pill to swallow, well, you're not alone. It might be necessary, but it's going to be difficult. And of course, politically, there are already rumblings within the Labour ranks. You might expect that. I mean, even the stormtroopers probably didn't sign up for this package. But this is where we are. And you saw the reaction in the markets and from businesses to the last budget. They're calling this a spring forecast, not a budget. It's a budget. But in October, when they announced they're raising taxes and seriously whacking businesses and therefore any hopes of pay rises or new job opportunities, that was a disaster. So now they've obviously gone in the other direction and they've got Morgan McSweeney, the new chief of staff, in there cracking the whip and making sure that the ironclad fiscal rules are held to. It doesn't help that you've got reform snapping away at your heels on the right, and that's got some people pretty nervous at the top of the Labour Party. But nonetheless, it does mean that on Wednesday, not just Labour MPs, but a lot on the left are going to kick up a massive fuss over this. They're going to call this austerity on steroids. They're going to absolutely hate it. They're going to say this is the Tory party in disguise. I mean, to be honest, the Tory party would absolutely love to have implemented half of what this Labour government have done in the last couple of weeks, but there we are. It can be done. You just need to have the will to do it. Anyway, the wealthiest in society, they're going to claim that they are not receiving the brunt of this, these cuts. It's going to impact the worst off the most. So you've already seen this. So Alfie Sterling from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation has been pretty vocal on it. And he's been pointing out that the solution, in his view, isn't to keep slashing public spending. Instead, he argues that raising taxes for the wealthiest, here we go, this old chestnut, a wealth tax, yet again, ding, 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 wealth tax klaxon, could help reverse the decline in living standards without adding further pressure on those who can least afford it. I mean, fine, we hear this every 10 minutes, it seems. Why don't we just raise taxes to a 100-year high? Let's just go for it. So what do we get? Where do we go from here? Bit of a crossroads, aren't we? On the one hand, we have a government that is pursuing cuts because they think is the only option to balance the books. On the other hand, you've got the squawks within the party claiming that these so-called austerity measures will not be enough to fix the fundamental problems in the UK economy. Look, either way, looking at the data and saying we're going to be worse off in 2030 by such an extent suggests there's a real risk that we're digging ourselves into an even deeper hole here. Economists many of them have written to the Financial Times, have been adamant that cutting investment is not the answer. They say the UK, although they argue that the UK cannot simply cut its way to growth. We need strategic investments that will foster long-term prosperity, not just short-term savings. And to them, I would just simply point out that they must have fallen asleep during the October budget, because didn't we raise borrowing by about 40 billion and taxes by another 30? No, we need more taxes. That'll be the antidote to this. It's worth noting that public services are obviously facing challenges. Yes, I know that. Local government, justice, prisons. We saw the early prisoner release scheme. So clearly investment in certain areas is absolutely necessary. And there's a strain on local communities. Something radical does need to be done. But this argument that we need to pull for the borrowing lever once again, I just don't think people are smelling the coffee on this one. Even if you just forget the economics of this, if you forget the Financial Times journalists and the think tanks, all that, and you just look at this from a political perspective, it is really interesting as well. Half of this stuff, you wouldn't be surprised to see George Osborne beaming with joy at the dispatch box, announcing half of it. In the last year, what we've seen. So cuts to welfare, cuts to disability payment, the winter fuel allowance, massive cuts to the civil service. By the way, it was Jeremy Hunt who said about 100 million times that he was going to get the size of Whitehall, of the civil service, down to pre-pandemic levels. Didn't do it. Now, finally, it seems the Labour government are going to do it. So what do I mean by politically? What are the ramifications of this? Look at how the backbenchers start to agitate. That's the interesting thing. They might have a massive majority, but it is shallow. And in areas like the Lib Dem, the southern Lib Dem blue wall seats, are those MPs going to start getting a little bit antsy over this stuff? They're going to have Lib Dem snapping at their heels. How do they manage that whilst also keeping on side the Red Wallers? They're also facing trouble from the Reform lot. So balancing all this is a big deal. And honestly, I can see Morgan McSweeney's hands all over this. He's the chief of staff now. And he is the one, I think, who is most worried about the right flank of the party, of the Reform Red Wallers. It's more complicated than that. But that, I think, is informing a lot of these decisions. And it's really interesting to see if Labour can hold that coalition together. Anyway, so looking forward to the spring statement. The question we must ask ourselves is this: can we afford to keep kicking the can down the road? Or is it time for something slightly more radical in terms of policy? We're at a pretty pivotal moment, it seems. People are going to be significantly worse off, according to this data. And you can feel it already, and we haven't even had the impact of the rise on national insurance for businesses yet. We haven't even got there yet. So brace yourselves, it could get ugly. Anyway, as always, I'll keep you up to date on the latest developments as they unfold. But for now, there's no avoiding the tough reality. It's going to get difficult. And if the government doesn't act decisively, could be in for an even worse ride. Thank you for watching. This has been Adam Cherry. Sorry it's been a depressing one, but there we are. Don't forget to subscribe to the GB News YouTube channel for even more.